inherent worth and dignity of every person. It does not say the inherent worth and dignity of nice people, does it? That would be easy. It says every person. That's pushing it a bit, right? What about the nasty ones? The liars and cheats, the criminals, those who orchestrate genocide. What about, dare I mention, Hitler? Even if we stay present, if we looked at all the murderers and rapists in maximum security prisons today, how can we have a sense of their worth or want to grant them dignity? Do these principles really apply to that population too? Is there inherent worth and dignity in them? Are they really also part of the interdependent web of life? Well, there may be a lot of answers to those questions. I approach this question of evil and the challenge to our principles from 3 points of view. 1, I look at them as a psychotherapist. 2, as an adoptive mom. And 3, as a theologian, as a ministerial student. So I went ahead and studied evildoers. And guess what I came up with? When I looked at statistics for the worst offenders, I found studies which show that way over 90% of those in maximum security prisons had a major interruption of caretakers during the first 2 years of their lives. Interesting, huh? In addition to that's a little beyond coincidence. What are the developmental tasks we have in the first 2 years? Well, in addition to the physical ones, lifting the head, rolling over, learning to crawl, learning to walk, and then the mental ones, responding to cues, responding to words, recognizing them, uttering sounds. We have an emotional challenge. That challenge is attachment. Unless a child attaches to someone, unless she or he bonds to a steady caretaker, severe psychological damage can result. A few decades ago, the Romanian government wanted to save some money, so they placed all orphans into institutions in which only their physical needs got met. It was a disaster. Many of the babies just developed failure to thrive and died. Others had severely psychological damage. Some even showed symptoms of being a sociopath. That makes sense because in the attachment process, the human conscience develops. Without attachment, it does not. It is not something we're born with. It is something that needs nurture to grow and establish in the psyche. There's a spectrum of attachment. It's not all black and white. There are shades of gray. There are people who have limited attachment and therefore might have a limited conscience. There are, of course, many people with a well-developed conscience and some without any at all. Having a conscience or not matters. The conscience is that wonderful internal reminder prompting us to live by our values. It is essential for empathy and compassion. It is an alarm which triggers guilt to guide us towards appropriate, caring behavior. Without attachment, without a conscience, that does not happen. I remember visiting in a local jail, teaching groups of inmates about emotions, and the topic of guilt came up. And one inmate asked, but what if I don't have that? It would be great to have an internal alarm to stop me from making bad choices, but there's nothing there. So we had to talk about his early childhood neglect and ways to live without having attached, without a conscience, without internal values. Was he evil? No. He had attachment disorder. Now, let's take Hitler's example. We might as well tackle the worst, right? Yes, Hitler grew up and had 2 parents, but his attachment was severely interrupted, especially in the first 2 years of life. He had 4 older siblings and 1 younger sister. 3 of his older siblings died the year before he was born, while Mom was pregnant. The only remaining older sibling died during his first year of life. Now, I've lost a child before, but I can't imagine a woman losing 4 kids in the period of 2 years while having to care for an infant. And it was a domestic violence household in which both the mom and all the kids got beaten severely, regularly. There was no chance for there to be steady nurturing in the first 18 months, which are crucial. So it's fair to assume that he had reactive attachment disorder, the disorder unbonded children develop. And what characteristics do such children tend to show? Children and adults with reactive attachment disorder tend to be charming and inspiring, able to influence and motivate others, yet have very selfish motives, and attempt to control their environment through dishonesty and manipulative behaviors. Does it fit? I sure think so. Looking at Hitler's rise to power looks very different from that perspective. So was Hitler evil? I was born and raised in Germany in a German family, so this is a relevant question for me to tackle. I was raised to believe he was evil, and we as German children shared in this evil, and were therefore not allowed to ever wave a German flag or even learn the words to the national anthem, lest we catch the disease of nationalism and evil. We had to protect ourselves from becoming evil like Hitler on a daily basis. But do I think he was evil? No. I think he had reactive attachment disorder and did horrendously evil deeds. But I hold fast to the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, even the worst. Now, by now, you may be a bit confused. I've talked about the UU principles. I've talked about the problem of evil. The sermon was actually inspired by Gwen Goodman, who asked me to talk about adoption, having bid on a sermon topic at the last service auction in the fall. She asked me to talk about adoption, and I haven't mentioned that topic so far. So let me tell you how it fits in. All of my adopted children were past their bonding age when I met them, and all had severe attachment issues that placed them at high risk. My oldest daughter was 9.5 when she moved in. Let me tell you about Hannah. It was the 80s. I had been volunteering for the gay and lesbian hotline in Tucson, a hotline that soon became the AIDS hotline, as the disease was spreading and information was badly needed. I learned as much as possible about this disease and gave information and referrals 1 night a week when the hotline was transferred to my home phone number. During the day, I worked at a domestic violence shelter, dealing with women and children in crisis and teaching them appropriate parenting interventions. I was single at that point, and one night watched the local news and heard there was a child with AIDS in Tucson who needed a foster home. The second I heard this, I knew that this was my child. Everything fit. I knew how to parent. I knew about AIDS. I applied for a foster care license and adoptive license, and I waited. Since I was out as a lesbian, and Ev Meekum was governor of Arizona at that time, I don't know if you remember him, that was a problem. The child was initially placed with an older social worker who had already raised children and had plenty of experience. But that placement fell apart. Why? Because Hannah was initially charming and sweet, affectionate and cuddly, but also a compulsive liar, sneaky and oppositional and very manipulative. You see, Hannah had full-blown reactive attachment disorder. She had been born to an IV drug-using mom in the 70s in the Bronx and had been severely neglected. By age 2.5, she'd been abandoned and the state took custody of her. She had recurring pneumonias and ear infections all along, but no one knew what to test for at this stage. They just knew her immune system wasn't functioning. But no one knew about AIDS or HIV in the late 70s and early 80s. She went through about a dozen foster homes and over a few years' time had severe behavior problems in all of them. She was even adopted and moved to Tucson with that family, but the problems continued. Her behavior was manipulative, defiant, and she would blatantly lie to your face. She was severely abused, and CPS severed that first adoption. So when the next foster mom gave up too, this experienced social worker who finally didn't want to be lied to yet one more time, the state decided it didn't matter that much after all that one was gay. And I became the first openly gay foster mom in Arizona. On July 1st, 1987, Hannah was brought to my house with 2 cardboard boxes, one with her clothes, one with her toys, her worldly belongings. We had dinner, bath time, got her settled in. I read her a story and tucked her in for the night. I was sitting in my dining room writing letters when I suddenly heard a voice behind me. "Mom, can I have some water?" Oh, how that touched my heart. I'd never been called mom before that moment. And this child knew I was her mom. I bonded to her right that second. But she didn't. It actually took me a while to figure out that she called any female caretaker mom, since she'd been through too many homes to remember names. She was charming, musical, artistic, and a lot of fun. And she was difficult, manipulative, dishonest, and violent. I was in my 20s, and it was quite a challenge. I just started a new job soon after she came to me as Minister of Children, Youth, and Family at St. Francis in the Foothills. Among other things, I was in charge of the religious education classes for 3 Sunday services with lots of teachers. And one of the teachers came to me and said, "Well, the class is going great. The curriculum is good, but there's this one child in class that was really out of control. Unfortunately, it was my child who would run into traffic anytime she didn't like something in Sunday school." That was a problem. I needed to do something. I found out about attachment therapy, which involved holding a child against their will when they threw a fit. Hannah was 10 by then, and this was a technique to use on toddlers and preschoolers. Oh well, she wasn't getting any younger, was she? I managed to take time to at least attend half a workshop, and soon after she threw a fit again, screaming and hitting, and this time I did not walk away. I held her safely. I grabbed her wiry body and used my arms and legs to restrain her, and I asked her to look at me. She wouldn't. She would continue to scream and spit and try to hit and kick and headbang me. She fought hard for about 45 minutes. I started to lose hope and strength. I wanted to give up on this crazy attachment therapy. I held on, though, if for no other reason than I would have been clobbered if I'd let go. "Look at me, Hannah. Just look at me." Finally, she stopped squirming. She dared a glance into my eyes, and she looked. Oh, did she look? Her eyes became huge. She would not stop looking. She held on tightly. I gently relaxed my hold, and she was clinging to me now. Staring into my eyes, almost without blinking, holding me tightly for several minutes. That is the moment she bonded to me. That was the first time she attached to another human being. In that moment, her brain made some essential connections, and she developed a conscience. Oh, she'd still be oppositional at times. She had her issues. But now she had compassion. She had values. She cared. And she was deeply bonded to me. When my partner Melvin came into our lives a few years later, Hannah was a different child than the one I had struggled with, holding her while being screamed and spit at. Oh, she went through a teenage rebellion, but she grew up, she moved out, she became an advocate for people with HIV/AIDS. She spoke at World AIDS Day events and at local high schools. She was loved and admired, a dynamic and caring person. At age 22, she moved back in with us for hospice care. She had beaten the odds so many times medically, but this final infection was too much. She was bonded to us, so she asked Melva and me to hold her hands when she died, and we ended up doing just that in August 2000. She left us a remarkable young woman who had inspired many in her short life. She had bonded, and she had become a person who knew her own inherent worth and dignity, and that of others. That's why I adopt. It matters. It matters whether children get a chance or not. Actually, the year before Hannah died, we had adopted again. With our next two, we got a lot of counseling support, and they bonded and overcame their attachment issues well. All my children ended up with a conscience, with strong values, and they learned to believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and the interconnected web of life of which we are a part of all. All kids have issues, of course, and those who've been through trauma and abuse or abandonment early in life, or exposed to drugs and alcohol before they were born, will have more challenges. That makes sense. Does it mean all adoptive children have bonding issues? Of course not. But they are all individuals with inherent worth, and they are at risk of not being treated that way unless they're adopted into a loving family. That is where our community comes in. Identifying groups who are at risk for not getting basic care and dignity, that's what we UUs are good at. We speak up for the immigrants, documented or otherwise. For those with gender orientation and identification issues. We believe in the inherent worth of dignity of all, and one way to express that is to give more children chances at a wonderful life. Children who cannot be raised with their birth parents are at risk, and they deserve attention, love, and care. And in case they have attachment issues, they deserve support to bond and develop a conscience. They deserve to be treated according to our first principle, honoring their inherent worth and dignity, and having a chance to express and develop that. As I take ministry courses in my process towards becoming a UU minister, I read many views on theology. One of my favorites is Rebecca Parker, the current president of Starr King School for the Ministry in California. Rebecca Parker's theology is best summarized as love first. It is a social gospel, focusing on social action and justice, but it goes beyond the social action and challenges us to inner transformation. It has a definite emphasis on love. Love no matter what. Love first. Let me explain what that means. It was inspiring, for instance, when many people donated millions to the rebuilding of New Orleans. That was love. But that was not love first. That was love after, wasn't it? The crisis had already happened. The inequity in housing was a fact that had existed for decades. The segregation of racial and ethnic groups in the city and the neglect of the dams was part of a long history. Love after a crisis is good, but it often does not get to the root of the problem. It is great that we as a congregation are now becoming involved in prison ministry. I've been involved in jail and prison visits for decades, and I know it matters. It always amazes me how few people actually bother to visit and help those who lost their freedom and are incarcerated. That is a great love after action. But what would be the love first action to match this? Adopt. Adopt children and support those who have adopted and are raising adopted children. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a whole UU congregation to raise adopted children. The healthier an environment we provide, the more nurturing a community our children can grow up in, and the better their odds of a wonderful life. Every day, children are born who are at severe risk of being neglected and abused, and at risk for not receiving the minimal amount of nurturing it takes to develop a healthy psyche. Every day, hundreds of children in Arizona and many thousands across the country are waiting in group homes and temporary foster placements, waiting for a chance to be loved and parented, a chance to bond and develop psychologically in healthy ways. We can make a difference, and in our congregation, we are making a difference. Our congregation is filled with adopted children. Have you noticed? Okay, the interracial adoptions are a bit more obvious, but there are many others as well. Last year, 7 out of 10 kids in the coming of age class were adopted. In the recent youth service in March, 3 out of the 5 teens who participated were adopted. When I spoke at the middle school class last month, 75% happened to be adopted. Amazing. Oh, it's just fine to have homemade children. We thank you for this. They are beautiful and delightful. We have quite a few of those in the congregation, and we have tons of adopted children in this community. That is good. That is love first. Many of these children were born into harsh circumstances and either quickly and sometimes slowly found their way into new loving homes where they got to attach. They bonded with their new parents, their conscience developed. That is love first. That way we do not need to find ways to help them heal damage caused by neglect later. They get to be whole people, just like their homemade and homegrown peers. Sane individuals who are loved and have the ability to love others. They can love themselves as well and know they are beautiful and precious. They get to grow and mature, have amazing values, and learn to live by them. They can believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the interdependent web of life of which we are a part. They get to grow up loved, and they get to love first themselves too. And this congregation gets to consciously celebrate love first by embracing our identity as an adopting community, supporting children and their parents, whether they're biologically related or not. These children and teens are our families and our congregation's expression of the first principle of love first. In choosing love first, in choosing to care about our children, we stand in good company. I want to close with a reading from the Christian New Testament. In Mark 10, 13 through 16, we read, "People were bringing their children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but their disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, 'Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it.' And he took the children in his arms, placing his hands on them, and blessed them. So be it. Amen."